Please do.
Yes. Thank you so much, sir. A very warm good afternoon to all. On behalf of Amity Law School, Kolkata, I welcome you all to Technical Session 10. I would like to take this privilege to introduce our resource person for this concluding technical session of the 5-day faculty development program, Mr. Anil Malhotra. Mr. Malhotra attained Bachelor of Science in 1980 and Bachelor of Laws in 1983 from Punjab University, Chandigarh, and an LLM degree from the University of London in 1985. He studied comparative family law at London School of Economics, besides law and society at School of Oriental and African Studies. Well conversant with independently conducting civil service, company, matrimonial, and allied litigation at high courts over India and Supreme Court. May I please ask the participant to mute the microphone? May I please ask the participant to mute the microphone? Thank you so much. Sorry for the interruption. Well conversant with independently conducting civil service, company, matrimonial, and allied litigation at high courts over India and Supreme Court, he also taught civil procedural laws and matrimonial remedies for 6 years as a part-time lecturer at the Faculty of Laws, Punjab University, Chandigarh. He has also worked at High Court as additional central government standing counsel from 1997 to 2000. For over 36 years, he continues to act as an Indian expert to render reports in foreign courts on appointment by the bench in overseas jurisdictions. He conducts matters in Indian courts pertaining to interpretation and application of foreign court orders regarding divorce decrees, child abduction, custody, maintenance, adoption, surrogacy, and family related issues of non resident Indians. He has co authored books titled Acting for Non Resident Indian Clients in 2005, India, NRIs and the Law in 2009, Surrogacy in India, A Law in the Making in 2013, International Indians and the Law in 2014, Surrogacy in India, A Law in the Making, revisited in 2015. India, uh, Inter-Country Parental Child Removal and the Law in 2016, and The Removed Child and the Law in India in 2018. He is working on an upcoming book titled Global Indians and the Law by Oakbridge 2020, which would be published in September 2020. Apart from this, he has significant published work internationally and has both global and domestic conference participations over 25 years. He has over 500 newspaper columns to his credit, besides significant published work in journals. He is a fellow of International Academy of Family Law, India Representative, Family Law Committee, International Law, London. It is a privilege to have you here, sir. We look forward to a great learning experience, and I request you, sir, to share your views on international family law in virtual world. Before that, I would like every participant to pay attention to the rules and regulations to be followed. During the entire session, please keep your video on switch off mode and mic in mute position only. The chat box is available in the chat box in the chat box in the Zoom window. Please use the chat box to post your questions and comments. Please note that the session will be recorded and will be available on the internet after the conclusion of the session. Please Home or the conversation should be
Hello,
done in
ma'am.
the chat.
Yes.
Hello.
So yes. Uh, Thank you,
Can,
ma'am. Yes. Thank you, ma'am. Before
The
our
session will be
eminent speaker.
moderated by Professor Munad Adhikari, Assistant Professor.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yes.
Before our eminent speaker, Mr. Anil Malhotra begins, once again I request all the participants to kindly keep the video and the audio buttons in mute mode and put the questions in chat box. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Amity Kolkata for giving me this honor of speaking on a very vibrant subject in a session which is the end of your program. Now, friends, the topic in which I will develop, as you all know, is international family law in a virtual world. Now, why do I say so? With the advancing facets of jurisprudence of different dimensions of family law, particularly in the pandemic times and the post period, private international law will soon become international family law, and practical rights may be difficult to implement. So in this virtual world, we will now see global sharing in an area of law, which was once a domain of domicile and confined to jurisdictions by virtue of the phraseology of private international law. I will run through 7 different parts, which are basically a content of my new book, Global Indians in the Law, to give you a bird's eye view of how in all these sections of family law, an emerging jurisprudence is showing, evolving both by the process of legislation and court judgments through practice directions, as we are seeing in different judgments which have come during the past 5 years. Now, first of all, I would like to talk of nationality, citizenship, and overseas citizen of India issues. Now, you all know that the Citizenship Amendment Act, Section 2, has brought in the definition added of who is an illegal migrant. Now, in this perspective, first of all, Article 9 of the Constitution and Section 9 of the Citizenship Act both do not permit dual citizenship. So this means that the moment any of our 30 million non-resident Indians acquire a foreign passport, they cease to be citizens of India. And since the Constitution does not permit you dual nationality, the Citizenship Act was amended in 2005 and we created a new category of citizens which is known as overseas citizens of India. Now, this is not a dual nationality. It is only a lifelong visa facility for you to remain in India without registering yourself with the police or the Foreign Regional Registration Office. You do not enjoy any political rights and you do not have any equated rights as of an Indian citizen. Now, with this, you can only stay in India for a certain period of time. The Passports Act 1967 does not allow you to hold an Indian passport as long as you have a passport of any other country, which means once you acquire a foreign passport, you are supposed to surrender your Indian passport. Now, you can be deprived of an Indian passport under Section 6, 5 and 6 of the Passports Act on 13 different grounds, but you cannot be denied a passport on any other ground. Your right to hold a passport was recognized way back in 1967 in Satwant Singh's case, followed by Maneka Gandhi's case in 1978. Now, an interesting offshoot in this jurisprudence has come in the area of Tibetans. Tibetans who followed the Dalai Lama in 1959 have settled significantly, about 2 lakhs of them from 1959 onwards. So all Tibetans who are born in India between 1959 and 1987 as a cutoff date are entitled to an Indian passport. Now they hold a Tibetan identity certificate by virtue of their government in exile. So the Delhi High Court and Karnataka High Court, by 2 very vibrant decisions in 2010 and 2013, have held that that identity certificate per se does not disenentitle them, to an Indian passport because they are born in India and they would be entitled to citizenship of India. Now, under Section 9 of the Citizenship Act, there is also a quasi-judicial process of determination of nationality, which means technically that unless and until there is an inquiry that you are not an Indian citizen, you cannot be deported. This is particularly relevant in the case of foreign Talbigi persons who are sought to be detained, but the Supreme Court has said without an inquiry and determination of citizenship, you cannot be deported out of India without this process being undergone. Now, the citizenship also assumes interesting dimensions in the perspective of the fact that the citizen also enjoys certain benefits in the realm of, let us say, surrogacy, let us say, adoptions, and let us say, in the nature of other benefits in family sections, which I will come to a little later. But there have been different interpretations from varying points of time about people who are OCIs or foreign nationals of Indian origin of their disentitlement to any benefit. But the fact remains that a citizen of India or a non-citizen of India is a person, and under Article 14 of the Constitution and Article 21 of the Constitution, for violation of his rights of equality of law and equal protection of laws, and under Article 21 of his right to life and personal liberty, he or she can invoke the jurisdiction of the High Court or the Supreme Court under Articles 32 or under Article 226, as the case may be. Now, this brings me to a very well debated and very well litigated area, that is marriage and divorce. Now, principally, the maximum amount of law which has been culled out is in the area of marriage and divorce. Now, way back in Teja Singh's case, the Supreme Court enunciated principles of private international law in 1976, and it is over that Dicey and Morris conflict of laws have evolved the various principles of private international law. Now, essentially speaking, simply to understand, in India we have multiple statutory laws governing personal communities. For the Hindus, you have the Hindu Marriage Act. For the Parsis, the Parsi Marriage and Divorce Act. For the Christians, the Indian Divorce Act. For the Muslims, their own personal law, etc. Now, we do not have a uniform personal code except for the state of Goa, where the Portuguese code known as the Uniform Family Code in Goa applies. But insofar all other territories in India are concerned, the Hindu Marriage Act is application. Now, majority of Indians are Hindus, and under the Hindu Marriage Act, once you solemnize a marriage by performance of religious rites and ceremonies, which are the essential part of a Hindu marriage, you are governed by the Hindu Marriage Act. And sections 1 and 2 talk of extraterritorial application of the Hindu Marriage Act by saying that your Hindu Marriage Act will apply to you wherever you go, whoever you may be, wherever you may be domiciled. So if you're a Canadian domiciled in Toronto, but you're a Hindu, you're an American living in New York with a US passport, or you're living in Great Britain, in London, holding an English passport, and you are a Hindu, you will remain a Hindu. So essentially speaking, your Hindu marriage can only be dissolved in India by a court of competent jurisdiction by applying the Indian law of marriage. And if you seek to dissolve your marriage, unless the other spouse consents, by the irretrievable breakdown of marriage method in a foreign jurisdiction, that dissolution of marriage would be null and void as far as India is concerned. So if you have solemnized a foreign marriage under the foreign law, you may dissolve that according to the foreign law of domicile of that jurisdiction. But insofar your Hindu marriage is concerned, that can only be dissolved in India. And likewise come the issue of ancillary relief, meaning custody, meaning child support, meaning maintenance and alimony. So broadly speaking, the other debatable area in this jurisprudence is regarding maintenance, alimony, and settlement of matrimonial property. Now, invariably, you have a stranded spouse in the Indian jurisdiction who need support. Now, Indian courts don't stop from awarding maintenance in the currency in which the earning spouse is earning in a foreign jurisdiction, and do enforce that right by way of the property or assets of the spouse in India, if the case may be. However, executing the decree in a foreign jurisdiction by taking a precept or in any other fashion may be a difficult proposition. And insofar divorce issues are concerned, the grounds of divorce are as contained under Hindu law. Now, if you wish to do a divorce by sitting in a foreign jurisdiction and you have the mutual consent of the other spouse, that is perfectly possible, which means, in a sense, you can appoint a general attorney as a family member or a parent or somebody in India if you're abroad. So can the other spouse do. You can arrive at a mutual consent and a settlement of all other issues. Put that settlement before the court as part of your petition under Section 13B by mutual consent. Affidavits of your special power of attorney holders, the general power of attorney holders can be put before the court. The court can seek your consent after identifying you through your relative or your power of attorney holder. First motion of divorce can be passed and second motion can be passed simply by video conferencing process, and the marriage can be resolved by mutual consent. So this is actually a virtual world with real rights. In the jurisdiction in the north, this mode of dissolution is quite popular because we have a significant non-resident Indian population all over the world, contributing to 30 million non-resident Indians. But recently the Supreme Court, invoking the power under 142 to do complete justice between parties, has invoked the 13B formula by video conferencing recording the settlement after transfer petitions were moved to the Supreme Court for transfer of the matrimonial petitions from one court to the other. So they cut short the process. When the parties had arrived at a settlement in the mediation cell, it was converted into a petition for mutual consent divorce, and Supreme Court, using its powers, the extraordinary powers only which Supreme Court can exercise under Article 142, dissolve the marriage by a decree of divorce. Now, the next area which is available to the woman, particularly in a bad marriage, let us say in a foreign jurisdiction, coming from a foreign jurisdiction, is the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act 2005. Now, it is very common for spouses to be facing charges under 406, that is breach of trust, 498A, matrimonial cruelty, and the Dowry Prohibition Act for invoking it against a spouse in a foreign jurisdiction. But the Supreme Court holds that the Indian Penal Code has no extraterritorial application. So this means, in a sense, that if the marital dispute or differences have taken place in a foreign jurisdiction, cause of action has not arisen in India, the IPC will not apply. But however, if part of the cause of action, demand for dowry or matrimonial cruelty, has occurred in India, obviously the Indian courts would have jurisdiction insofar the place of occurrence where the matrimonial cause of action has arisen. But the interesting question is, what is the position regarding domestic violence? Now, in domestic violence, as you know, even live-in relationships or relationships in the nature of marriage, besides marriage partners having differences, domestic violence reliefs in the nature of rights of residence, rights of maintenance, rights of protection, financial aid, etc. are available before a magistrate in a very summary jurisdiction. Question is, if domestic violence is suffered, can Section 26 of the Domestic Violence Act help you in invoking the provisions of the Domestic Violence Act? Now, Section 26 of the Domestic Violence Act says that the jurisdiction where the wife is residing, the magistrate concerned in that jurisdiction will have the power to initiate and entertain a complaint for domestic violence. But the issue whether if the domestic violence is suffered abroad and the complaint is sought to be preferred in India, is an issue which has not yet been settled by the Supreme Court and is a debatable issue. Now, the answer to this may be that if the Domestic Violence Act of the country where the domestic violence is suffered has an independent remedy, would the Indian Act apply? Per se, the Domestic Violence Act would not go abroad because the Domestic Violence Act of India will have application in India. But again, it is a debatable issue and nothing concrete in the shape of a decision either way has come across from the Supreme Court. Now, the next issue which I wish to talk about is maintenance in matrimonial matters. Now, as you all know, in India, we follow a need-based formula. Unlike jurisdictions abroad where there is a split or a 50-50 division of assets acquired before, acquired after or during the relationship of marriage. But in India, we do not do so. Interim maintenance is on a 1/3 formula, meaning 1/3 of the income is given to the non-earning spouse. And as far as alimony is concerned, it is mostly lump sum and it is again on a need-based basis without any arithmetical formula being in place under the Hindu Marriage Act. So alimony and maintenance come in as ancillary reliefs under the Hindu Marriage Act or the Special Marriage Act. But as we all know, maintenance is also available as a proposition of being a religion-free secular arrangement under Section 125 of the CRPC. You also have maintenance under the Hindu Adoption and Maintenance Act, and you also have maintenance or ancillary or matrimonial relief under the Domestic Violence Act. As a matter of fact, courts have held that invoking 125 CRPC, Section 24 HMA, or the provisions of DVA are all available simultaneously, though the quantum may vary from one to the other in case of any issue arising if the maintenance has been awarded. Under the DVA, the spouse has also got a right to live in the shared accommodation of a spouse, provided the name of the spouse, that is the husband, is in the ownership. However, if the property is owned specifically by the father-in-law or the mother-in-law, then in such a situation, the wife would not have a right of residential accommodation in such a property, and she would not be entitled to make any claim as far as the property of her in-laws are concerned. Now, the next question which comes is enforcing of judgments of orders of foreign courts in family matters in overseas jurisdictions. Now, implementation of matrimonial judgments from foreign jurisdictions, the principle normally apply, which in case of a judgment coming from a foreign jurisdiction, is Section 13 and 14 of the CPC. Section 13 says when foreign judgments will apply, there are a number of grounds mentioned, and if any of the grounds are not fulfilled, then the foreign matrimonial judgment is not applicable. For example, it should not be opposed to principles of public policy, it should not be contrary to Indian law, it should not be founded on any principle of law which is against India, and so on and so forth. So if you have a foreign decree of divorce and settlement arrived at on behalf of on one spouse, with the other spouse being a passive spectator or non-participant, then the irretrievable breakdown marriage decree divorce shall not be enforceable in India, and you would have to seek a divorce again, and such a decree would per se not find implementation in India. Now, if the reverse case is sought, if you have an award of a matrimonial judgment in India and you seek to have it implemented abroad, the practical side is very difficult. The best way forth is if the assets of the spouse living abroad are available in India, so you should seek attachment of the property or a restraint on alienation of the assets of such properties as a best possible remedy to avoid the property from being sold or given away to defeat your interests. Now, the next area which is very heavily in litigation is law in relation to custody of children and child removal in India. Now, inter-country, interparental child removal is a very common phenomenon in matters pertaining to marriages which are between spouses living abroad, when two spouses are of Indian origin, or one spouse is of foreign origin and one spouse is of Indian origin. Now, interparental child removal is not identified, recognized, or labeled as a wrong or an offense under Indian law. Section 6 of the Hindu Minority and Guardianship Act says that the natural guardian of a child shall be the father, and after him the mother, provided that the custody of a child less than 5 years of age shall ordinarily be with the mother. Recently, the Supreme Court is doing away with gender preference, but the fact of the matter is that the father and the mother are natural guardians, and therefore India does not recognize interparental child removal as a wrong or as a offence under either civil or criminal jurisprudence. Now, therefore, when a parent removes a child and brings a child to India, or when within India the custody of one parent is taken away from the child is taken away from the custody of one parent, the parents resort to remedies under the Guardian and Wards Act 1890. It is a 130-year-old law. The Law Commission has recommended that this law should be amended. The Hindu Minority and Guardianship Act also needs amendments, but nothing has been done by the Parliament. So the natural parent goes to the Guardian and Wards Act judge or the family court if there is one in that area, and seeks the appointment as a sole guardian in exclusion to the custody of the other parent, and during the interim seeks interim custody exclusively. The other parent may be awarded visitation and interim custody, or access if he's in a foreign jurisdiction. But the implementation of that is proving to be difficult in pandemic times. Now the situation becomes a little complex and complicated is when a parent from a foreign jurisdiction seeks to implement a foreign court order regarding child custody. Now it is in that context that the writ jurisdiction of a high court as an extraordinary remedy is sought under Article 226 before the High Court, or directly under Article 32 before the Supreme Court. Now the the right to seek a remedy by way of a writ is by a writ of habeas corpus. The writ of habeas corpus does not apply to secure release from illegal detention, but it is for the court to exercise its parent's peculiar jurisdiction. That is, the guardian of the child, the court is the guardian of the child in such a situation, and the court should exercise its powers for the welfare of the child. This was recognized way back in Gohar Begum's case in 1960, and we saw the first judgment in this case in Surinder Kaur's case in 1984, where the court said that the child should be returned to the country of its origin from where the child was removed. After 1984, we had the judgment of the Supreme Court in Ruchi Maju's case by Justice Thakur, where Justice Thakur said that Section 9 of the Guardian and Wards Act allows a child custody to be sought only if the child resides within the jurisdiction of the guardian judge. If the guardian judge has no jurisdiction, which means that the child is not residing in his jurisdiction, then the guardian judge has no authority. But the High Court, of course, under 226, has extraordinary powers to take a call on what to do, whether to return the child or not to return the child. So the next judgment came in Dhanvanti Joshi, where the Supreme Court said in 1998 that we should not automatically comply with foreign orders. We should go into the merits of the matter. Then in 2010, we had a very interesting matter where a woman who brought her son from the US kept moving place to place within India, and under Article 32 in Dr. Ravichandran's case, the Supreme Court ordered CBI to find her, and ultimately the child was ordered to be returned to the US. Then, after Ravi Chandran, we had the well-known judgment of the Supreme Court in Surya Vadanan. Surya Vadanan, authored by Justice Lakur, was a landmark judgment. It laid down three principles: comity of courts, theory of jurisdiction of closest contact, and the theory of first strike. It said whatever jurisdiction took cognizance, it will take preference. So this brought in a lot of settled precedent till we had Nityanand Raghavan's judgment in 2017, when the Supreme Court did away with the theory of first strike, did away with comity of courts, and left only the principle of jurisdiction of closest contact to say that whichever jurisdiction has closest contact will take a call to decide on the jurisdiction of the matter. Then, after Raghavan, we had two more judgments of the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court in Kanika Goyal held that the principle of comity of courts will not find application, and the call will be taken in the best interest of the child by holding a summary or a detailed inquiry, and an automatic removal will not be the answer. Whose two children were in Delhi, and we
Sir.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, sir. Now you are audible. Yes.
Okay. So the Supreme Court in Soban Kodali versus Lahari Sakhamuri, which is the most recent in point of times, and Lahari Sakhamuri versus Soban Kodali following a Hyderabad judgment, the Supreme Court has brought back indirectly comity of courts and has, in a way, said that the parental preference will not be a rule. There should be shared parenting, there should be joint custody, and so on and so forth. But as I told you, in Navtej Singh's case, we have evolved through the medium of the courts a mirror order jurisprudence. Now, what does that mean? When I petitioned in a writ of habeas corpus seeking implementation of a US court order, the court did grant me a favorable order, but it said you will provide protection to the spouse, not seek criminal enforcement or prosecution. You will give her maintenance. You will not separate the mother from the children. You will help her to take part in the legal proceedings to resolve the matter in the US. And then the court said, now you go and get these conditions made a part of the American order. So I had to go back to the US court and seek modification, meaning the ex parte interim custody granted to me was revoked. And subject to the wife returning to the US, or the order again was taken back and sought to be implemented in the US. The lady challenged the order in the US, but meanwhile we had also been to the family court because the decision on jurisdiction was said to be not acceptable in the Supreme Court. So the guardian judge also went into the matter of merits and matter in the family court in Delhi, granted an order that the children should go back to the US, which order was upheld by the High Court, and both the orders of the High Court in habeas corpus and in the matrimonial appeal were before the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court again laid down a fresh conditional order for the woman to go back, And there we saw the mirror order jurisprudence as the way out. Now, why do I say so? Now, this is a very important development in the private international law regime, and which is why I talk of an international family law in a virtual world. We are not a signatory in India to the Hague Convention on Civil Aspects of International Child Abduction 1980. 100 countries have signed it, we have not. So if a child is removed to India, then the child will not be removed back through the process of the convention. In the convention, children from country to country are returned through the medium of the Hague Convention, by which every country creates a body called a central authority and a domestic legislation, whereby this process takes place. I was an amicus for 12 long years in the High Court of Punjab and Haryana, where I assisted the court in finding a way out for this in a child removal matter. And I gave a report which the judge, as a part of its order, sent to the Law Commission. The Law Commission made a bill. The Government of India constituted a committee comprising of 6 honorable judges, 6 government officers, and I was co-opted to the committee. We have given a report. We have recommended a bill, Inter-Country Interparental Child Removal Bill, which is yet to see the light of the day before Parliament. But the fact remains, till a law is in place in this jurisprudence, the mirror order jurisprudence seems to be the way forward. Now, the Supreme Court recently in Yashita Sahu in 2020 has given some kind of a recognition to this method by talking of committee of courts, access of the children to both the parents, visitation, contact, and said that if the lady does not wish to go back with the children, then the children should be returned to India, to the US with the father alone. Now, this brings me to another very important area of private international law, which is inter-country adoptions. Now, as you all know, India, with its population of 1.3 billion, has 12 million plus orphan children. Inter-country adoptions were a very devious racket of removing children unethically to foreign jurisdictions. Lakshmikant Pandey, 3 successive judgments, 84, 86, and 88, led to the Juvenile Justice Act being enacted in 1986, amended in 2000. But meanwhile, India had signed the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1993. So all the rights of the child, that is the right of the child to a nationality, right of a child to a home, right of a child to parents, were to be enacted and made part of legislation, as is to be done once India signs an international convention. So we amended the Juvenile Justice Act, and now we have a Juvenile Justice Act of 2015, and in which there is a definition of the best interest of the child, and there are all the essential features of the UNCRC incorporated. Even in child abduction matters, the best interest of the child definition has been successfully used by me for a court to decide what is the best interest and welfare of the child. So be it adoption, be it child removal, the court has to follow a universal principle which you will find in the Family Courts Act, the Hindu Marriage Act, the Hindu Minority and Guardianship Act, Guardian and Wards Act, that the welfare of the child will be the paramount consideration insofar any issues concerning his custody or his placement is concerned. Now, adoptions, therefore, slowly, after Lakshmikant Pandey, came into a realm whereby they are now governed by the Juvenile Justice Care of Children and Protection Act 2015. Now the JJ Act is in 2 parts. One is dealing with juveniles in conflict with law, and the second is dealing with children in need of care and protection. And it has a 3rd chapter of rehabilitation and social integration, whereby adoption is the key feature insofar often abandoned or surrendered children is concerned. Now the JJ Act of 2015 all of a sudden has become a very debatable issue, because the JJ Act provides for the Central Adoption Resource Authority as a statutory body to oversee all adoptions, meaning adoption of children by parents, giving to adoptive parents, often abandoned or surrendered children, or children who are in need of care and protection. CARA was initially an administrative agency, now it is a statutory authority. Now, Hindu Adoption and Maintenance Act provides adoption of Hindu children by a process of giving and taking, by a ceremony of Datta Homan, for which no deed is to be written, no registration is required, and no court order is necessary. And Hamma, as a personal law, under section 56(3) of the JJ Act is saved. But the larger question which arises is what happens to adoption of children when they are to be taken abroad? Now, India is a signatory to the United Nations Convention and Recognition of Adoptions 1993. And under this Hague Convention on Adoptions, we have to follow the international principles laid down in the Convention on Adoptions. Now, the Convention on Adoptions requires a process to be followed for adoption of children as laid down by a domestic law, and which is now in the JJ Act and the Adoption Regulations 2017. But what is the situation arising when a child is to be adopted by, let us say, relatives, a sister giving a child to a sister, or between two brothers, a child being adopted under Hamma, and this child needs to go out of India? How would CARA need to give an NOC like all inter-country adoptions? I'm an amicus in a matter which is yet to be decided. But prior to the JJ Act, there was the Supreme Court judgment in the Nokha, which said that there is no requirement of giving such a child, no NOC requirement is there, because the JJ Act looks at abandoned, orphan, and surrendered children, which are to be given and taken by virtue of the court overseen process and all protections under the Act. But the courts say when there is a natural parent giving to another parent, where parentage is known, you do not need the procedure. But the fact remains that you can opt for the procedure of the JJ Act yourself voluntarily, even if there is a parent-to-parent adoption. But if you choose to do it under Hamma, the JJ Act exempts you from doing so. But the question is of the NOC by CARA. The questions which come is that even passport authorities refuse to give a passport to an adopted child, saying, please get an NOC from CARA. Though there is law on the point that the passport authorities under the Passport Act have nobody to refuse the passport to an adopted child because they can't question the adoption. Adoption under Hamma is irrevocable and final. But then the question is, would an embassy of a foreign country give you a visa for a child to be taken out of India? No. The answer to this is the convention itself provides exemption and recognition of domestic adoptions. So the best way out is that CARA can give an NOC that this is an adoption under the domestic law, and therefore it is recognized and exempted, and therefore the NOC will be given, which will enable the child to go out of India. Anyway, this remains a heavily debatable and a contestable issue, and is still to see a final decision. There is a judgment of the Kerala High Court in a domestic matter, where the court has very clearly said that in domestic adoptions, the JJ Act has no role to play. Now, friends, the next area which is of great interest is surrogacy. Now, surrogacy is a concept which has evolved in India through the ICMR guidelines of 2005. We now have bills of 2020, which are still before Parliament. Law has not grown, but the practice of surrogacy has grown multifold. It is now a 25,000 crore industry with 2 lakh clinics all over India. We banned it, it shifted to Thailand, it shifted to Vietnam, and now it is in Ukraine. So surrogacy is still alive. You can't stamp it, you can't kill it. But the fact of the matter is that it has grown immensely. in different jurisdictions, and we are finding that surrogacy is at loggerheads with law concerning adoptions. Now, going back to adoptions for a short, brief period, under the adoption regulation and under the Juvenile Justice Act, you can adopt a child irrespective of marital status or of nationality. So, if you're a single person, you are unmarried, you are a foreigner, you can adopt from India. But insofar surrogacy is concerned, things are a lot different from how they were. Now, this all starts in surrogacy with the guidelines of 2005, as I told you. Then we had bills. There was a 2010 bill in surrogacy where surrogacy was allowed to foreign nationals, OCIs, PIOs, etc. And more or less it was quite liberal. But then in 2012, the Home Ministry issued visa guidelines saying that only people with a medical visa would be allowed to come to India for surrogacy. I had challenged these conditions because medical visas were not allowed to single persons. The government came to court and said we have not made a law. The matter was therefore left inconclusive. Then we had the 2014 bill, the 17 bill, the 19 bill, which is now the 2020 bill. So you have the Artificial Reproductive Technology Bill of 1990-2020. The current situation is that under the bill which it then existed, the surrogacy was allowed to infertile Indian couples with 5 years of marriage, and it was totally banned for foreigners, OCIs, nationals, PIOs, and you had to have a certificate of proved infertility. There was a lot of resentment against this, so Parliament constituted a 21-member committee. They gave a report, and pursuant to that report, a lot of changes have taken place. Surrogacy is now allowed to infertile Indian couples. The period of marriage is of not any requirement anymore. Persons of Indian origin have been allowed. However, foreign nationals and unmarried persons or persons in same-sex relationships are not allowed surrogacy. So this is the current state of the bill. It is not yet been finalized. It was supposed to be taken up in March, but because Parliament is adjourned sine die, this law could never be brought into place. But the question which is debatable and which will arise for consideration is whether you can have distant laws for surrogacy and adoption when the purpose of parenthood is the same. Can you ban surrogacy for persons irrespective of marital status? Can you disallow surrogacy to foreigners? The better way would be to make a regulatory law like adoptions. But we must see that the Supreme Court is evolving law. We start with ABC versus State in 2015, where the Supreme Court, following UN conventions, gave the right to an unwed mother to have a birth certificate without the father's name. Then in 2014, we had National Legal Services Authority, which talks of transgender as a third right. Then in 2014, we also had Shabnam Hashmi's judgment, where Supreme Court said that Muslims have a right to adopt as well. Then we had 2013 Stephen Joan Becker, where a 53-year-old American mother was allowed to adopt a 10-year-old daughter as a single parent, even though it was disallowed by all the courts. We have the privacy judgment, 9-judge constitution bench by Puttaswamy. We have Navtej Johar decriminalizing homosexuality. We have various judgments, Devika Biswas in 2016 talking of right to life and right to reproduction. We have a right, Suchika Srivastava, of a right of pregnancy and right to carry a pregnancy to full term to 2009. Now, with all this development of jurisprudence over a period of time, can we reconcile the conflict between surrogacy and adoption? We have seen Shilpa Shetty, we have seen Sunny Leon, we have seen Tushar Kapoor, we have seen Karan Johar, Amir Khan, Shah Rukh Khan. They have all done surrogacy. Did they satisfy the norms? Did they follow the rules? What law is in place? Where do things stand? And the issue is, why do you wish to debar persons, irrespective of marital status, from entering into surrogacy when you are allowing adoptions and achieving the same purpose of parenthood? Now, this is going to be a debate once the law is made, and it will see a challenge. Obviously, whenever the act is put in place, there will be a challenge to it, and things will come into place, and maybe this matter will get resolved. But this is a very debatable issue. Surrogacy is not allowed in most jurisdictions in the world, except the US. In Europe, there is a conflict with the church. There are ethical issues, there are moral issues. But in India, the question is, the surrogate says, if I have a right to a livelihood, a doctor who is practicing surrogacy says, I have a right to practice surrogacy. How can my rights be taken away? So these are balancing rights which will need to be equated. And this is all going to be the job of family law, not any other law. So this will obviously have a lot of questions, but we'll take it up on that score. Now, the next issue, which is in private international law, is succession. You die abroad, you have assets in India, you're a foreign national. What law will apply? What will you make? Simple, straight answers. Assets in India, movable or immovable, Indian law of succession. If you leave a will, Indian Succession Act. If you do not leave a will, Hindu Succession Act. Plain and simple. Foreign assets to be governed by foreign jurisdictions. Wherever your immovable assets or movable assets in a foreign country are, you will have them governed by the law of that jurisdiction. So law of domicile is what applies. And the best of advice I give professionally is, if you have assets in two jurisdictions, make an Indian will for Indian assets and make a foreign will for foreign assets, so that the law of the country where you live will apply to you and you will have your assets determined and adjudicated accordingly. So the principle of domicile is what governs what is applicable to you. People choose to have their Indian assets divided as per Indian law, because we do not have any estate duty, which was abolished. But in foreign countries, you have an inheritance tax, which is a sizable population, which is a sizable part of tax of your property. So to avoid any incidence of inheritance tax in India, people choose the route of having Indian law applicable to them. Now, the next area in this realm is anti-suit injunctions. Now, with travel becoming difficult, with movement being awkward, and pandemic forcing you to remain in your country, you will have parallel litigations between the same parties on the same issues in a matrimonial relationship in two different jurisdictions. So you have a petition in Calcutta or Mumbai, and you have a petition in New York or London or whatever the case may be. Which takes preference, which is to be heard? This is governed by the principle of anti-suit injunctions. Now, this is a commercial law principle which evolved in disputes where there was litigation in commercial matters in two jurisdictions between same parties. And in Modi Entertainment, the Supreme Court laid down principles, but basically the most convenient forum from the perspective of the location of the parties, the cause of action, the litigation starting first, are what guides the court into an anti-suit. So you have in matrimonial matters a forum shopping formula. So you don't get relief in one jurisdiction, you try the same relief in another jurisdiction. Now it is in that situation that a spouse can say, this litigation is already pending here, party is the same, relief is the same, please restrain the party from not proceeding with the same litigation in another jurisdiction. This is what is anti-suit. So you can't, the court cannot restrain a court in another jurisdiction, but the court, party before the court, can be stopped from pursuing the litigation in that jurisdiction. And this is what is anti-suit. It is not a very developed jurisprudence in India. Courts are yet working on it. I have done expert reports on helping courts to resolve these issues. In foreign jurisdictions, you can have matrimonial property division without a divorce. In India, we can't do that. We have it as an ancillary. In foreign countries, you can have child custody straight away. In India, you can have it too, but then which is a preferential jurisdiction. So anti-suit is a remedy availed of to stop a party from litigating in an inconvenient forum, and it is a discretionary relief. The court is the best judge to decide whether an anti-suit is to be granted to you or not. Now, this brings us to the summary of the whole thing. How will we give real justice in virtual courts? How will we handle children? Everything can wait, children cannot. William Wordsworth, in his famous poem Child is the Father of the Man, talking of heart leaping up, said that the child is the father of the man. Lord Alfred Tennyson, way back in his poem The Memoriam, talks of a child as an infant crying in the night, a child crying for light, and with language but none but a cry. Friends, children cannot wait, families cannot wait. We will have to evolve methods, we will have to create methods of resolution of cases. You may have to give rights by video conferencing, you may have to give virtual rights of access by WhatsApp calls, by internet, by emails when children are bigger. We may have to come back to committee of courts. When travel to jurisdiction is not possible, courts may have to evolve a formula whereby orders passed in one jurisdiction should automatically be implemented without the court going behind the order. Such like thinking may have to evolve over a period of time. We may need the Hague's assistance. The Hague Conference on Private International Law sits at the Hague and drafts various conventions, two of which we are a party. We are also a party to the Hague Conference, which means we take part in the discussions regularly. We may need a Hague Conference on surrogacy, because children born out of surrogacy, we have had Jan Bala's case where 2 German children were taken away out of India through the assistance of the Supreme Court by a process of adoption. Because they were granted Indian passports, the government of India came in appeal saying they cannot be granted Indian passport, the parents are Germans. The court said they can't go back through parenthood because Germany does not allow surrogacy. So the parents who gave birth to them, the German parents, through an Indian surrogate, let them go after they were adopted by them. This is the fallacy of the law not being in place. We had baby Manji Yamda's case where the grandmother came to the Supreme Court and took the child because the Japanese parents who had given birth to the child had divorced by them. And the Supreme Court gave an identity certificate to the child with one-time permission to leave India. Now these are court-evolved methods which courts will evolve. But we need a statute. When will the statute come? The COVID-19 pandemic has left us totally stumped. We were not prepared. Family law is as it is a poor country cousin in India. We have not evolved anything after 1955, 1956. Law Commission has recommended changes in all family laws. We do not have a uniform civil code. So friends, in this backdrop, we talk of an international family law in a virtual world. And with this, I pass on to you for questions as you wish to put. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for providing us with such clear understanding of the topic international family law in virtual world. The participants have asked a few questions. So with your permission, may I put a few questions before you?
Yes, please.
The first question asks, what are the pros and cons of implementation of Uniform Civil Code or Common Personal Law regulation?
See, it would be a very happy situation if we had a uniform civil code in place. But practically to have a uniform civil code in India is going to be very difficult because the personal laws of the communities made by Parliament are so strongly entrenched in every personal community that a uniform civil code would be an impossibility. But it's not something which cannot be done. In Goa, you have Muslims, Hindus, Christians, Parsis, Jews, and they follow a Portuguese family law code of 1800. It is accepted by everybody. It is called the Uniform Civil Code, and nobody talks of personal law. It would be an ideal situation, but a utopian principle. It's too far away. Maybe another century, and Parliament has to do it, not the court. Next question, please.
The next question is, does same-sex marriages related claims under foreign degree is enforceable in India?
See, India does not allow same-sex relationships. In Navtej Johar, we have only decriminalized homosexuality. In the Domestic Violence Act, we have recognized relationships in the nature of marriage. We have accepted them with a pinch of salt. But the Hindu Marriage Act does not recognize a marriage between people of the same sex, nor does the Special Marriage Act, nor does any personal law. In Britain, you have the Civil Partnerships Act, where you recognize relationships between the same sex. So if there is a foreign judgment of same-sex marriages, I do not think it will agree with Section 13 and 14 of the CPC, because it is not founded on a policy recognized by Indian law. So it would not be implementable in Indian law. Sorry, try some other jurisdiction.
Sir, third question is, do you feel India should adopt community property model as against the prevailing separate property model?
I think that's a very good idea. There should be community of property, whereby when there is an earning spouse contributing, let us say the husband or the wife, it should not go into a common kitty. There may be a situation where, very inconsistent situation in the joint family property, that you may find that the contributions of a spouse may be passed on by one of the parties to the marriage into the HUF. And if it is the wife, and let us say her husband dies, the property will go to the HUF, not to her. It can create a very anomalous situation. And there may be unfair divisions. There may be no identification line of who contributed to whom. So a community of property, meaning equal ownership of property between two spouses, is the need of the day. I would endorse that. Next question, please.
Okay, sir. Sir, next question is, what do you think about the criminalization of commercial surrogacy and the fact that the LGBT and the single parents have been specifically excluded from the bill as per the 2020 latest bill?
See, according to me, what has been banned, as I understand it, is commercial surrogacy. So commercial surrogacy of any form is going to be punishable. But criminalizing surrogacy for people doing surrogacy between persons of the same sex, I do not think is a good idea. If for purposes of adoption of children, you are allowing persons irrespective of marital status. Now, this is a very open interpretation of who could be persons irrespective of marital status. So single man or a single woman, or an unmarried couple, or unmarried persons, if they are allowed to do adoptions, then why can't people of the same sex be allowed to do surrogacy? We have had a lot of Israeli couples doing commercial surrogacy in India. It was commercial at that point of time, but India did allow it. And when they went back, their countries had to adopt laws to let the children go. We have had surrogacy being practiced since 2005. We have let it go on for 10 years. Now, one fine day, we decide we are not going to allow it to a certain category of people. The question is, Supreme Court is giving me a right of privacy to Swami. Supreme Court is giving me a right of reproduction as a right to life by vibrant interpretations of the Supreme Court in different decisions. Transgenders are being recognized as third rights, third sex. Same-sex relationships may not be finding acceptance in law in the nature of being marriage. But if surrogacy is sought by persons and he wants to adopt a child, why can't he do it through surrogacy? So criminalizing surrogacy, I think, for LGBT is not a good idea. When the Supreme Court is opening up on relationships outside marriage into different things, and even the Domestic Violence Act is recognizing relationships in the nature of marriage, though we are not clear whether domestic relationships would be between same sex or between persons of opposite sex. So these are debatable questions, but decriminalization is required when there is a same-sex relationship. Commercialization, yes, is bad, but when there is no commercialization or altruistic purposes are there, then surrogacy should be allowed. Next question, please.
Okay, sir. Sir, the next question is the COVID pandemic has created in lots of death unexpected. What will happen to a baby born out of surrogacy and natural parents expired before the handing over the baby?
You see, if this sad situation arises, let me make you aware that the Juvenile Justice Care and Protection of Children Act will move in immediately. You have the Child Welfare Committee in every district, which will take the custody of such child through the hospital concerned or the institution, take the baby in its care in a foster care or an adoption home, notify all relatives concerned or people concerned by a public notice claiming the custody of the child. They may be relatives, they may be grandparents wanting the child. But if that child is not adopted, not taken on by anybody despite a public notice, then the child will be put up for adoption. So rehabilitation and social integration is the formula which we can move in surrogacy, because the child will be sadly an orphan, abandoned or a surrendered child, which will fall in the definition and the nomenclature which is available under the JJ Act. So to that extent, the JJ Act can come in. It's a very good question, a hypothetical question, but it may be a reality. Next question, please.
Thank you, sir. Last question is...
No, don't stop the question. Let them go on, no problem.
Okay. No, we have some time constraint. So, sir,
you can go on. You can
is...
go the questions. Please don't stop the questions.
Okay. Sir, what, according to your opinion, a comprehensive legislation covering NRI marriages is required to be enacted?
I think we need it very badly. We need to sort out things on this front. We need to, first of all, we need to bring in irretrievable breakdown as a ground for marriage, divorce, particularly when there is a foreign couple or there is an NRI element in the marriage, because in India it is thought that divorce is a long, lengthy, cumbersome process. So if mutual consent is allowed, then breakdown should also be allowed, hedged with safeguards, so that couples don't adopt to foreign jurisdiction. Then we can still keep the principle of Hindu marriage being dissolved in a court of competent jurisdiction in India intact. So a comprehensive review of matrimonial law is very much necessary. So amendments in the statute to have a comprehensive legislation to take care of grounds of divorce, to take care of maintenance, to take care of settlement of property, and to take care of custody of children is the need of the day. It's very important. Next question, any more, please?
Sir, we can take one more question.
Yes, please do. We can cut short your validity, but we should not cut your questions.
Okay. The status of Indian Parsi women marrying a non-Parsi man and the children of such marriage. What is the status?
You see, there have been cases where once women, because Parsis are a very close-knit community and they have the Parsi Marriage and Divorce Act governing them. Now, if there are rights of succession arising under the Parsi law, and there is exclusion under Parsi law of in such a situation of inheritance, that will apply. But if there is a will and the Indian Succession Act applies in such a situation, then irrespective of whatever the Parsi law says, you will have to give way to the Indian Succession Act. But there have been cases where if you marry a non-Parsi, you do away with a lot of rights. But I think the Supreme Court recently has given a decision doing away with such discriminatory practices. But the fact of the matter is, we have to open up. Supreme Court is, for example, Sabrimala. Whether women have a right to pray in the temple at Sabrimala is a question of right to freedom of religion. It is to be decided by a 9-judge constitutional bench. Would Muslim women have right to pray in mosques? So these are personal law questions in conflict with constitutional provisions. Where do we harmonize them? Where do we balance them? Now, these are social norms which keep changing with times. What was an accepted societal practice in a community 50 years ago may not be the norm because social thinking has changed. Mores have changed, modes have changed, mannerisms have changed. Talking of somebody as dark and fair is bad. We had a judge recently commenting on a phrase which he found in an FIR as very offensive. It is the George Floyd effect. So it is a question of how society reacts to law. I remember studying law and society in South Asia way back in SOAS. And this is what family law is all about, societal norms. Any more questions?
Sir,
I'll be happy.
Thank you once again, sir. Okay. So now I would request Professor Dr. Mononita Kundu-Das, our HOD, Amity Law School, Kolkata, to extend the vote of thanks to Mr. Anil Malhotra and address the valedictory section.
Thank you, Dr. Malay. A very good afternoon to one and all. I, on behalf of Amity Law School, Kolkata, and the entire supporting team, extend a very hearty vote of thanks to Mr. Anil Malhotra, author, legal analyst, IAFL fellow, and alumni of SOAS, London, partner international lawyers, Malhotra and Malhotra Associates, Chandigarh. Sir, on your topic, international family law in virtual world, we have benefited immensely on an area which is debatable. There are certain topics and issues, no doubt, not only in the legal fraternity, but when we in class with the students indulge in debates, these issues do come up. And your talk will certainly give us a clarity as to how to approach on certain issues like adoption, intercountry adoption, questions of jurisdiction. And certainly in this situation at present, which we are facing with the advancement of jurisprudence in the pandemic world, the concept of citizenship, private international law, then the questions like Tibetans having citizenship, our passport laws, nationality, the OCI, and the debates on marriage and divorce. These are ever continuing debates which will definitely benefit us. The debates particularly on maintenance, child custody, settlement of properties, which is a very important issue and on which we have several questions which does comes up between all of us. Yes, now please switch off your microphones. Now, next, sir, your deliberations on protection of DB Act 2005, the Dowry Prohibition Act, no doubt, which are very important areas. It has given us knowledge for teaching the students in class in a very streamlined manner. Sir, your deliberations on inter-country adoption, specifically with the position of India and also the Hague Convention and the entire concept of surrogacy, surrogacy in this pandemic situation. The question which was talked of just now, which you gave a very vivid answer to the one of our participants. Sir, it will definitely benefit us. It will help us as teachers and also not only teachers, as citizens in this society, this will definitely benefit all of us in the legal fraternity, the teachers, the researchers, and everyone. Once again, thank you, sir, for a wonderful lecture on family law in a pandemic situation, the international family law in a virtual world, and also thanking the entire team of Amity Law School, Kolkata in this FDP Technical Session 10. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Malay. And now I'll move on to the concluding remarks. The concluding remarks is a summary of the entire sessions which we had taken from day one, that is from 6th July, Monday, till today, the 10th session. Each session, I'll just briefly give you a small summary so that it is more or less like a recollection of the entire FDP. Now, first day, if we could recollect all our participants, we opened with inaugural session on 6th with the keynote address of Professor Dr. Hegde of Jawaharlal Nehru University. Now, Professor Hegde, he talked on impact of international law on municipal laws while emphasizing on holistic concept of international law vis-a-vis the municipal laws. He went on to deal with international trade regime and the impact of technology and security in international trade legislations. Further, we found that Dr. Hegde delved upon the laws relating to internal and external migrants, especially during the post and pre-pandemic circumstances. He went on to add to the various ways of teaching and research in the academia. Now, next, in technical session 1, on the same day, on 6th, we had Dr. Shubir Roy from Bankura University. He discussed on the growing importance of non-doctrinal research with the difference between doctrinal and non-doctrinal research, questions of law and fact, and the importance of comparative jurisprudence thought processes in coming to a definite conclusion for the study of law. So this was our day 1 of the faculty development program on 6th July. Now moving to the next 7th July, that was our technical session. We started with technical session 2, and our speaker was sorry, this was session on the same day. Okay, it was Dr. V.V. Balakrishna Reddy. Now, Dr. V.V. Balakrishna Reddy, he talked on the relationship between the international law and domestic law, and his topic went on to say, we can say, at a never-ending discussion, and it helped us to understand the relationship that exists between the systems of law, various theories which have been formulated in times, and also the institutional mechanism in the implementation of law, where we found that international law and institutional mechanisms, they work largely on the concept and backdrop of consent of the states. Domestic law has an advantage of using the institutional mechanism in its implementation. So we found that Professor was talking on global crisis by active